If you read the tablet in February 2024, you may have seen the following letter. Many years ago, a good school friend, on return from his studies for the priesthood in Rome, told me about his Viva Voce examination with the celebrated Canadian Jesuit Bernard Lonergan. Cur celibatus, Lonergan had asked him, "Why celibacy?" My friend gave a detailed spiritual and theological reply. "Non," said Lonergan. "Res economica, it's about money." Has anything changed since then? Now, if you've only ever listened to popular accounts of the history of clerical celibacy, Father Lonergan's answer is the one you'll typically hear. What you won't typically hear is the answer I'm going to give you in this video, namely that priestly celibacy has its origins in the apostolic tradition of the Church. It's not about money. But whether you agree or disagree with what I say, hopefully you'll agree that there is a lot at stake in getting the answer right. For if Father Lonergan was correct, and it was all about money, then one can make a good case for getting rid of priestly celibacy by arguing that the economic reasons for imposing the discipline of priestly celibacy are no longer present. And many people are arguing for this and are longing for the day when married priests in the Catholic Church becomes the norm. But what people making this argument perhaps don't realise is that there are some priests who are actually attracted to the priesthood precisely because of the theological and spiritual reasons for celibacy. That celibacy is a radical act of self-giving by which a priest is more closely conformed to Jesus Christ, whose bride is the Church. It would therefore be really quite tragic if a young man was inspired to become a priest for these theological and spiritual reasons, only to be met by a wall of cynicism when he entered the seminary. Now, before we move any further, I should clarify the terminology I'll be using. People use the word celibacy in a variety of different ways. According to Wikipedia, celibacy is the state of voluntarily being unmarried, sexually abstinent, or both, usually for religious reasons. In this video, I'll be using the term celibacy in the both and sense rather than the exclusive or sense. That is, I'll take celibacy to mean the state of voluntarily being unmarried and sexually abstinent for religious reasons. If a person is sexually abstinent but may or may not be married, then I'll refer to such a person as being continent. By the clergy, I will mean the body of people within the Church who are clerics, and by a cleric I will mean a bishop, priest or deacon whom the Catholic Church deems to be validly ordained. So according to this definition, Catholic and Orthodox bishops, priests and deacons are clerics and hence members of the clergy, but Anglican bishops, priests and deacons are not. I apologise if this definition causes offence to some Christians, but it would be beyond the scope of this video to discuss the Catholic Church's criteria for valid ordination. Now, I presume that when Father Lonergan said that clerical celibacy is all about money, he had in mind the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century as well as some pronouncements of the Church in the 12th century that were meant to deal with various abuses that had begun to take hold in the Church. Of particular concern was the abuse of so-called ecclesiastical benefices. Ecclesiastical benefices instituted a means that ensured priests who had a specific role in the Church could receive a steady income. For instance, if the priest was assigned the responsibility of ministering to the Catholics belonging to a particular village, then in virtue of having that responsibility, the priest was entitled to an income from some of the land which was owned by the Church. However, the unfortunate situation arose where a priest could receive income from the ecclesiastical benefice without carrying out the ministerial responsibilities associated with it. Furthermore, it became commonplace for secular rulers, rather than members of the church hierarchy, to decide who would be ordained and entitled to these ecclesiastical benefices. And so the system became more and more corrupt, with the result that secular rulers with entirely worldly motives would arrange for men to be ordained who had little to no interest in the care of souls. To address the abuse of ecclesiastical benefices, we're told that in 1077 Pope Gregory VII prohibited clergy from getting married. Then a few decades later, at the Second Lateran Council in 1139, it was declared that not only was it prohibited for clergy to get married, but also that it was impossible for clergy to get married. Any marriage attempted by a bishop, priest or deacon was deemed invalid. It was this series of events that led to the widespread belief that priestly celibacy was only introduced in the Catholic Church in 1139 at Lateran II. Now, while it is indeed the case that there was widespread abuse of ecclesiastical benefices, there is one fundamental flaw in this historical account of clerical celibacy, namely the assumption that clerical celibacy was imposed as an innovation in the 11th and 12th century. However, this is not how the church hierarchy understood things. Rather, the church hierarchy understood their prohibition of clergy getting married as only reaffirming the discipline of continence that had been demanded of priests since apostolic times. The church hierarchy was well aware that many priests failed to live in accordance with this apostolic tradition, but no pope or council of bishops recognized by the pope had ever permitted priests to get married or have conjugal relations with their wives if they were already married when they were ordained. Rather, all the papal and conciliar declarations up until the 12th century regarding this matter stated that priests were to be continent. Now, what I've just said is very controversial. Many people will object that in the Orthodox churches, priests are not only allowed to be married, but are often required to be married. And once ordained, Orthodox priests are allowed to continue having conjugal relations with their wives. Moreover, many people claim that it is the Orthodox practice rather than the Catholic Church's practice that belongs to the apostolic tradition. Also, many people will dispute the claim that no conciliar declarations prior to the 12th century permitted priests to have conjugal relations with their wives. For instance, you'll hear people often speak about the intervention of the Bishop Paphnutius at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. We're told that Paphnutius argued that continence should not be imposed on priests, and we're also told that the whole assembly of the clergy at the council assented to Paphnutius' reasoning. And there is also the Council of Trullo in 692, which clearly states priests are allowed to have conjugal relations with their wives. Another objection people will make is that according to the most obvious interpretation of Scripture, there was no requirement of continence for priests, and that to say there is such a requirement is in effect to muzzle the word of God. These are all objections that need to be addressed. Now, there is a huge amount of literature concerning clerical continence. At the end of the 19th century, the Hungarian theologian and bishop Augustine de Voscovany compiled a list of all the works he knew of that were dedicated to this subject. It was a list of more than 7,000 titles. I have to admit that I haven't looked through Voscovany's list, so I'm very far from being an expert on clerical continence. Nevertheless, I have done a little bit of reading on this subject, and here are some texts that I found very helpful. Firstly, there's a short book titled The Case for Clerical Celibacy by Cardinal Alphonse Stickler. Secondly, there's an important book titled Apostolic Origins of Priestly Celibacy by Christian Cochini. Another important book is Clerical Celibacy in East and West by Roman Cioli. Cioli has also written an article published on the Vatican website titled Priestly Celibacy in Patristics and in the History of the Church. Also on the Vatican website, you can find an article titled The Biblical Foundation of Priestly Celibacy by Ignace de la Poterie. These two essays belong to the book For Love Alone, which was commissioned by the Congregation for the Clergy in 1993. You'll also see from the cover of this book that it includes an essay by St. Teresa of Calcutta. Another book I can highly recommend is Celibacy in the Early Church by Stephen Hyde, which builds on Cochini and Cioli's scholarship. There's also the online chapter Celibacy, A Historical Perspective from the book Priestly Celibacy Today by Father Thomas McGovern. And finally, it's worth drawing your attention to the Vatican document, the Directory for the Ministry and Life of Priests, since among other things, this document gives ecclesiastical authority to the thesis I'm defending in this video, namely that the Church from apostolic times has wished to conserve the gift of perpetual continence on the part of the clergy and chooses the candidates for holy orders from among the celibate faithful. If you have an opportunity to read all this material, then you should be able to respond to all the objections raised to clerical celibacy that I've just mentioned. As well as responding to objections to clerical celibacy, I hope this video will motivate people to think about the theological and spiritual reasons for clerical celibacy. Promising to live a life of celibacy is not to be taken lightly, but unfortunately there are some priests and bishops who have taken this promise lightly, and the results have been disastrous. Men training for the priesthood need to be psychologically and spiritually prepared for the celibate life. If they are not, they will find the celibate life very lonely, and they will very likely end up living a double life. But if they are suitably prepared for making this commitment, then they will find the celibate life incredibly enriching, and they will see it as essential to the fruitfulness of their Christian ministry. Now it will be helpful to make the distinction between two legal terms, jus and lex. Following the legal theorist Hans Kelsen, Alphonse Stickler tells us jus is any obligatory legal norm, whether it be established orally or handed on by means of custom or already expressed in writing. Lex, on the other hand, is any regulation established in a written form and legitimately promulgated. This legal distinction is important because it would be a serious methodological error to assume that the first records of a law as lex coincide with the introduction of a law as jus. For one thing, it can be often difficult to know whether a written law, lex, is the first occurrence of that law in writing, for many texts have been destroyed over the course of history. For instance, we know that the archives of the Church in Rome were destroyed during the Diocletian persecution at the beginning of the 4th century. And secondly, even if we have reason to think that a written declaration of a law is the first written declaration of its kind, it still could already have been an unwritten law, that is, jus, for many generations. And we can be sure that there were such unwritten laws, because St. Paul himself tells us this in his second letter to the Thessalonians. Stand firm then, brothers, and keep the traditions that we have taught you, whether by word of mouth or by letter. Now, the first piece of written legislation regarding clerical celibacy comes from the Council of Elvira in Spain around the year 305. Cochini tells us that 19 bishops from the most diverse areas of the Iberian Peninsula attended this council. Among the most significant of the canons regarding clerical celibacy is Canon 33, which states, "It has seemed good, absolutely, to forbid the bishops, the priests, and the deacons, i.e., all the clerics in the service of the ministry, to have sexual relations with their wives and procreate children. Should anyone do so, let him be excluded from the honour of the clergy." Cochini goes on to say, if the law of the Council of Elvira is the first canonical document relative to priestly continence that has come down to us, it does not automatically mean that it inaugurated a new discipline. While they did not refer to a previous synod, or, as the bishops of Carthage would later do, to a more ancient tradition, the members of the Spanish Assembly also did not give the impression that they were aware of innovating. Nothing is said about a previous discipline, whereas so important a measure would have demanded such a reference, so as to break free from it if that was the case, and to explain for what reasons one had been led to do so. When one reflects on the magnitude of the canon's demands, the silence of the legislators is easier to explain if they were repeating and confirming a practice already common than if it were the opposite case. One does not brutally impose on married people, even if they are clerics, the harsh asceticism of continence without first telling why what had been permitted previously suddenly became forbidden. On the other hand, if the purpose was to correct infractions of an already ancient rule, and thus to address a current historical situation, it is easier to see that the Spanish bishops did not feel the need to justify such a rigorous measure. Now, someone may respond to Cochini's reasoning by saying that even if clerical celibacy predated the Council of Elvira, it doesn't follow that it must go all the way back to the Apostles. In response to this criticism, a fundamental principle to keep in mind is the one enunciated by St. Augustine of Hippo at the beginning of the 5th century in his controversy with the Donatists. What is kept by the whole Church and was always maintained without having been enacted by the councils is very rightly considered as having been transmitted solely through apostolic authority. Commenting on this principle, Cochini says, "There is a well-established historical fact. Fidelity to the tradition inherited from the origins is the rule of the ecclesial life in the early centuries. The constant reflex of writers and churchmen of the patristic times is to have recourse to this root authority in order to prove how solid their position they defend is. The general tendency during patristic times was therefore to preserve the deposit that had been transmitted, and not to innovate. The principle of St. Augustine mentioned above enjoyed the full weight of history at a time when so much value was granted to what had been transmitted, and when nothing could be transmitted with the guarantee of authority except what came from the apostles. So that, insofar as we can note that a point of doctrine or discipline is effectively kept by the whole Church, and had always been maintained, we are justified in thinking that it originated in the Apostolic age, even if it is not possible to point to a proof in documents preceding those in which such a point appeared for the first time in written form. The unanimity of the Fathers regarding this important issue therefore allowed St. Augustine to formulate the following conclusion in one of his works. They had preserved what they had found, taught what they had learned, and transmitted to their sons what they had received from their fathers. So does this principle apply to clerical continence? Oh yes, it does. For at the very least, we know that today all validly ordained bishops, whether they be Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, Oriental Orthodox or Assyrian Orthodox, are required to live in continence. So what is the simplest explanation for this consensus among bishops in far-flung corners of the world? Well, the simplest explanation is that there was a consensus among the bishops at a point in the Church's history when all the bishops lived in relatively close proximity to one another, and that would have been in apostolic times. But can we extend this argument to priests and deacons? Well, yes, we can. And we can establish this by using some passages which, ironically, many Protestants use to criticise clerical celibacy. These are 1 Timothy 3 verse 2, a bishop must be irreproachable, married but once, and then 1 Timothy 3 verse 12, deacons may be married but once, and Titus 1 verse 6, a presbyter, i.e. a priest, must be irreproachable, married but once. In each of these verses we have the phrase married but once. Trullo tells us the meaning of this phrase has been the subject of much dispute down the ages. Some in the early centuries had interpreted this Pauline principle as only excluding polygamy. Others considered it as meaning the election of a man who lived contentedly with one wife, whether she be from his first or second marriage. The most predominant interpretation, however, and that which was officially sanctioned by the early Church in its legislation, was that the injunction excluded from orders any man who had taken a second wife after the decease of the first. But why might we think this latter interpretation is the correct one? Well, it makes the most sense if you believe bishops are required to be continent once they are ordained. For if there is this requirement, then one would need to be confident that a man elected to be bishop could live in a state of continence. But if the man felt the need to take a second wife after his first wife died, then this could suggest the man would find it difficult to live in a state of perfect continence. This is the reasoning that the 4th century Pope Siricius gave. Cochini tells us that in the Decretal Cum in Unum, Pope Siricius elaborates an exegesis of the phrase married but once, claiming to be and stating it is the only one faithful to St. Paul's thought. If the apostle had asked Timothy and Titus to choose bishops, priests, or deacons among men married only once, this does not mean that he permitted these husbands, once ordained, to go on with their conjugal life and have more children, but the apostle asked this on account of the future continence that was required. Monogamy is a condition for receiving orders because fidelity to one woman is a guarantee that the candidate will be able to practice the perfect continence that will be required of him after ordination. This exegesis of St. Paul's instruction to Timothy and Titus is an essential link by which the bishops of the Roman Synod in 386 and Pope Siricius placed themselves in continuity with the Apostolic period. So if this is the reasoning behind St. Paul's married but once injunction in the case of a bishop, then we have no reason to doubt this same reasoning was behind St. Paul's married but once injunction for priests and deacons. So we can summarise this argument for the apostolic origins for clerical continence as follows. 1. Apostolic tradition is the simplest explanation for continence among bishops. 2. The apostolic tradition of continence among bishops requires us to interpret the injunction married but once as being motivated by the requirement of continence for those ordained. And 3. And the injunction married but once is applied not just in the case of bishops, but in the case of priests and deacons as well. So let's consider a frequent objection to clerical continence, the Paphnutius episode. The Paphnutius episode concerns an incident that is reported to have happened at the Council of Nicaea in the year 325. The primary source of this report is the 5th century Byzantine historian Socrates. In the first book of his Historia Ecclesiastica, Socrates writes the following: "We had promised earlier to mention Paphnutius and Spiridon, and the time has now come to speak of them. Now in those days Paphnutius was bishop of Upper Thebes, and he was such a friend of God that he was able to perform miracles. During the times of persecution he had one of his eyes plucked out. The emperor had such a great devotion to this man that he often had him brought to the palace. So great was the reverence Constantine felt for this man, that the emperor would kiss Paphnutius's empty eye socket. I will now relate what was decided thanks to his advice for the advantage of the church and the honour of the clergy. It had seemed good to the bishops of the Council of Nicaea to introduce a new law in the church. Consecrated men, I mean bishops, priests and deacons, should not sleep any more with the wives they had married while they were laymen. As the matter was under discussion, Paphnutius stood up in the middle of the episcopal assembly, and with a strong voice protested that such a heavy yoke should not be imposed on consecrated men. The conjugal bed is honourable, and marriage has no stain, he said. One should fear lest through an excess of severity the bishops might bring harm to the church. Not all are strong enough to live asceticism in total dispassion, and the chastity of the spouses would not be safeguarded with so many opportunities. It was by the name of chastity that Paphnutius did not hesitate to call a life in common with a legitimate wife. It is quite enough, he said, to require of these clerics that they not remarry after ordination in accordance with the ancient tradition of the Church. But let us not separate them from the wives whom, monogamous as they are, they once married when they were laymen." Thus spoke Paphnutius, though he himself had nothing to do with marriage, and in fact no experience with women. From childhood on, he had been raised in a monastery, and he was praised as a man of very great chastity, if there ever was one. The college unanimously rallied to his proposal. They therefore remained silent on the issue, and left it to the judgment of those who were ready to abstain from conjugal intercourse with their wives. Now Cochini gives us the following evaluation of this story. The problem with this narrative is basically that it is not part of the authentic documents of the Council of Nicaea that we have, and Socrates is the first and in fact the only one to know it and make it known. Now the Byzantine writer wrote his Historia Ecclesiastica in the mid-5th century, more than 100 years after the First Ecumenical Council, and in addition he is unable to provide the source of his information. Therefore, a healthy critical attitude calls for a careful screening of his claims to credibility. Stickler also tells us that in 1968, the German scholar Friedhelm Winkelmann published a paper on this question which definitively concluded that the episode is an invention. Winkelmann offers the following reasons. The person of Paphnutius is found only at a much later stage, his name appearing only in later manuscripts of the Acts of the Council, and in those from the 4th century he is known only as a confessor of the faith. It is only later hagiographic legends that began to consider him a miracle worker and father of the Council of Nicaea. So we can conclude that the Paphnutius episode is sufficiently unreliable to have any bearing on whether or not clerical continence has apostolic origins. Now let's consider the objection many people make regarding the fact that in the Orthodox churches, priests are not only allowed to be married, but are often required to be married, and once ordained, Orthodox priests are allowed to continue having conjugal relations with their wives. Given this fact, how can one claim that priestly continence has apostolic origins? To answer this question, we need to look at the Council of Trullo in 691. Cochini tells us the following about the historical backdrop to this council. While Christian Africa was agonizing under the blows of Islam, the Byzantine Empire was threatened on all sides by invaders. From 635 to 642, Syria, Palestine, Mesopotamia and Egypt had fallen with terrifying speed, one after the other, into the hands of the Muslim chiefs. Out of 4 eastern patriarchates, only one, the See of Constantinople, was still standing, bearing from then on in that part of the world the whole responsibility for the future of the Church. On the northern borders, the danger was no less significant. Slavic and Bulgarian invasions succeeded one another, creating a completely new situation in the areas located south of the Danube. After Illyria fell, Messia, Macedonia, Greece, and the islands of the archipelago were forced to accept foreign invasion. A deep transformation felt in all domains was brought about. Not only did the ethnic features of the empire change completely, but the consequences affecting administration and the religious and social evolution were overwhelming. That century of upheavals, which almost spelled the ruin of Byzantium, dragged the East into a decline that the spiritual energy of its leaders did not manage to overcome for a long time. The political shake-up had its effect on intellectual and moral life, bringing Byzantine society into an anarchy that can be compared to the disorder of the 5th century after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Council in Trullo opened at the end of the year 691 in a climate of open hostility towards Rome. Meant to complete the work of the 5th and 6th ecumenical councils, it practically left dogma aside to devote itself to problems of discipline that the 2 previous synods had neglected to treat. Out of all the legislation promulgated by the Council of Trullo, the decree of Canon 13, limiting the obligation of chastity for married men ordained as deacons or priests to a simple temporary continence, is the one that provoked the strongest reaction on the part of Rome. The text of Canon 13 is as follows: about priests and deacons, that they can keep their wives. As we have learned that in the Church of Rome, the rule was established that candidates, before receiving ordination as deacon or priest, make a public promise not to have relations any more with their wives. We, conforming ourselves to the ancient rule of strict observance and apostolic discipline, want the legitimate marriages of consecrated men to remain in effect, even in the future, without dissolving the bond uniting these men to their wives, nor depriving them of mutual relations at the appropriate times. In such a way, if someone is deemed worthy to be ordained subdeacon, deacon, or priest, let him not be prevented from growing in this dignity because he has a legitimate wife, and neither should it be demanded that he promise at the time of his ordination to abstain from legitimate relations with his own wife. For otherwise we would insult marriage, which was instituted by God and blessed by his presence, while the voice of the gospel calls to us, let no man put asunder those whom God has united. And the apostle teaches, let marriage be respected by all and the conjugal bed be without stain. And again, are you tied to a wife by the bonds of marriage? Then do not seek to break them. On the other hand, we know that the fathers gathered at Carthage as a precautionary measure because of the seriousness of the morals of the ministers of the altar, decided that the subdeacons who touch the sacred mysteries, the deacons and the priests too, should abstain from their wives during the periods that are specifically assigned to them. Thus, We also will keep what was taught by the apostles and observed since antiquity, knowing that there is a time for everything, especially for fasting and prayer. It is indeed necessary that those who approach the altar when they touch holy things be continent in every respect, so that they can obtain in all simplicity what they are asking from God. If therefore anyone acting against the apostolic canons dares deprive a cleric in sacred orders, i.e. a priest, a deacon or a subdeacon, from conjugal relations and the society of his wife, let him be deposed. In the same way, if a priest or deacon sends away his wife with the excuse of piety, let him be excommunicated, and if he persist, deposed. Now Cochini tells us that there are 3 anomalies worth pointing out in this canon. Firstly, contrary to where this canon might lead the unknowing reader, the Latin legislation did not see marriage as an obstacle to entrance into the priestly ministry. Being indissoluble, the bond could not be dissolved after consecration and kept all its force, as we have seen when St. Leo authorized husband and wife to live in the same home and took into account the bonds of mutual love that still attach them to each other. By prescribing total chastity to married clerics, Rome did not mean to put asunder what God has united, but to elevate their kind of life together with their wives to a level deemed compatible with what service at the altar demands. Secondly, it is rather paradoxical that what is granted to deacons and priests by this canon is refused to bishops. If the Trullo Fathers' interpretation of Scripture is correct, then surely it should apply to bishops as well. It is easy to see the inconsistency into which the Greeks fell. They order that if a married man becomes a priest, he must keep his wife. On the contrary, if he becomes a bishop, his wife must retire to a convent. And the third anomaly is Canon 13's invocation of the Council of Carthage, held in 390. Canon 13's reference to this council is clearly meant to legitimize itself by showing that it is in line with apostolic tradition. However, the problem with Canon 13's reference to the Council of Carthage is that Canon 13 doesn't say what the Council of Carthage actually said. As already noted, what the Trullo Canon 13 says is the following. We know that the Fathers gathered in Carthage with foresight in connection with the seriousness of the morals of the ministers of the altar, have decided that the subdeacons who touch the holy mysteries, the deacons and also the priests, must abstain from their wives during the periods that are particularly assigned to them. However, what the Council of Carthage actually said is rather different. As it has been a question of certain clerics, especially lectors, with regard to continence towards their wives, I would add, very dear brothers, what was confirmed in many a synod, that the subdeacons who touch the sacred mysteries, and the deacons and the priests, and also the bishops in conformity with the ordinances concerning them, will abstain from their wives, as if they did not have any. Another bishop at the Council of Carthage also said, in a previous council, when one spoke of normalizing the rules of continence and chastity, one dealt with the 3 orders that by virtue of their consecration are associated by a kind of link of chastity. I'm talking about the bishops, the priests, and also the deacons. We agreed, as is fitting to their state, that the very holy pontiffs, the priests of God, and also the deacons, i.e. those who are at the service of the divine sacraments, observe a perfect continence, so that they can obtain in all simplicity what they are asking from God, what the apostles taught, and what antiquity itself observed. So whereas the Council of Carthage said that priests and deacons must observe perfect continence, Canon 13 of the Council of Trullo misquoted the Council of Carthage, saying that priests and deacons only need to be continent around the times that they are exercising their sacramental duties, such as celebrating Mass. The reason the Fathers of the Council of Trullo were able to get away with misquoting the Fathers at the Council of Carthage is that the Trullo Fathers were Greek speakers, whereas the decrees of the Council of Carthage were in Latin. But it is because of this redaction of the Carthage text at the Council of Trullo that gave rise to the myth that the Eastern Church discipline of married non-continent priests is an older discipline than that of the Western Church, that requires priests to be sexually continent. But in any case, the papacy at the time was not happy with the Trullo fathers. The Pope, Sergius I, adamantly refused to sign the Acts of Trullo on account of those canons which were contrary to the order of the Church. So for the first time in history, a formal disavowal of the Oriental discipline was made by Rome. A few years later, another Pope, John VII, returned the acts that had been sent to him by the Emperor Justinian without signing them. Despite the papacy's hostile reaction to Trullo, this synod unfortunately had a rather greater effect on the Western Church's understanding of clerical celibacy than it should have had. The ultimate effect was this: it caused the church hierarchy to forget the intrinsic link between being a cleric and being celibate. To see how this effect came about, first note that although the Council of Trullo said that married clerics could have conjugal relations with their wives, the council nevertheless recognised that it was not permissible for an unmarried cleric to get married. Now, if even the opponents of clerical continence prohibited unmarried clergy from getting married, then this is strong evidence that this prohibition is a long-standing tradition. But we have to ask, why are unmarried clerics prohibited from getting married? If Cochini and Trullo are correct, and the requirement of clerics to live in total continence has apostolic origins, then obviously unmarried clerics won't be able to get married, since they wouldn't be able to consummate their marriages. Furthermore, since there is no earlier written legislation we know of than that of Canon 13 of Trullo, which permitted married clerics to have conjugal relations with their wives, the Council of Trullo marks a rupture between the prohibition of unmarried priests to get married and its cause, namely the requirement to live in total continence. The Council of Trullo's innovation in permitting married clerics to have conjugal relations with their wives therefore makes it very hard to understand any theological justification for why ordination should be an impediment to marriage. For the legislation of Trullo gives us no clue as to why the sacrament of ordination should render nefarious the sacrament of marriage when both are sources of grace and sanctification. So how did it come about that Trullo's legislation not only affected the Eastern Church, but also affected how Catholic theologians and canonists in the West understood clerical celibacy? Well, a 12th century Camaldolese monk called Gratian is responsible for this. Gratian was a master of the School of Law of Bologna and is generally regarded as the father of the science of canon law because of his opus magnum Concordia Discordantium Canonum, better known as the Decretum Gratiani, completed around the year 1142. As Trullo tells us, the importance of this work cannot be overestimated, for despite the fact that it always remained a private collection, it became the foundation for the classical law of the Latin Church. 10 years after its appearance, it was used in schools and synods, soon afterwards becoming the manual of the Roman Curia, and it stimulated a wave of canonical writing. The treatment that Gratian gave to the question of clerical continence and the impediment to marriage is therefore of some importance to us, for it had significant influence in the Latin Church. His method was to collect texts and to explain their sense by providing summaries and his own expositions. In this way he ordered or concorded a mass of texts which often seemed to contradict each other. A weakness in his work, however, was that he used texts whose authenticity he simply took for granted. Thus, for example, he adopted the episode of Paphnutius and gave it equal value to conciliar texts. He also gave to Canon 13 of Trullo ecumenical value. With Gratian, therefore, the Greek or Oriental practice regarding celibacy was not only accepted, but thoroughly legitimized. The text of Trullo Canon 13, presented by Gratian, established this practice as being of apostolic origin. Furthermore, the episode of Paphnutius was given an authority which it did not have even in the Eastern churches. The effect of Gratian's presentation of the Eastern discipline of celibacy was to sanction in the mind of future canonists the theoretical impossibility of a cause and effect relationship between the law of continence and the impedimentum ordinis, the impediment of ordination with regards to getting married. Not only did the decretists and decretalists of the golden age of canon law, from 1150 to 1350 recognised the difference in Greek legislation and practice, but they attempted to thoroughly accommodate it in a canonical theory that would also explain the law of celibacy in the Latin Church. The differences of the two major churches were regarded as being legitimate, and as expressing different ecclesiastical traditions, of which the Greek was assumed to antedate the Latin. Given that after Gratian, the discipline of continence was regarded generally as not being of apostolic origin, nor attached in any strictly necessary way to the exercise of orders, the theological reasons in favour of celibacy could only be regarded at most as reasons of fittingness or congruence. The relationship between the law of continence and the impediment to marriage of orders was, as a result, not regarded as being exclusively in accord with the nature of the thing, but mediated by law attached to order. A theology of celibacy dependent more immediately on the nature of the sacred order itself was rendered impossible by the fracture of the two mutually dependent aspects of celibacy, continence and prohibition of marriage. If the canonists and theologians of the 12th and 13th centuries had not been presented with the difficulty of the Greek discipline, legitimized above all by Gratian, it is quite conceivable that they would have had little hesitation in attributing the law of continence to the apostles and relating the impediment to this law alone. So in summary, it was Gratian's legitimization of the Council of Trullo that resulted in church theologians and canonists forgetting the intrinsic link between being a cleric and being celibate. Now, I began this video with the anecdote about the seminarian who gave a spiritual and theological answer to Father Bernard Lonergan's question of why the clergy are required to be celibate, and how Father Lonergan disagreed, saying celibacy was about money. Lonergan's answer is the one you'll hear over and over again if you read through the letter pages of the tablet, and it's the sort of answer that can make those people who give a spiritual and theological account of clerical celibacy look rather naive. However, if clerical celibacy is grounded in the discipline of clerical continence that has apostolic foundations, then Lonergan's answer seems untenable. So perhaps those of us who want to give a spiritual and theological account of clerical celibacy aren't quite so naive after all. There is far more at stake than how naive we appear when trying to understand clerical celibacy in theological terms, because a predominantly non-theological understanding of clerical celibacy has been and will continue to be extremely damaging to the Catholic Church if we do not challenge this non-theological understanding. If you want to see some of this damage, I suggest you read the book Sex, Priests and Secret Codes by Thomas Doyle, Richard Sipe and Patrick Wall. In the preface to the book, Sipe says, "The authors know celibacy inside out and respect it as a worthwhile and sanctifying living style for those who choose to live it and succeed without compromising their public stance with their private behaviour. However, research indicates that a majority of Catholic clergymen do not live up to this ideal. Celibacy supports a lifestyle that could free a man to devote himself to church service in ways that marriage might not allow. That is not to say, however, that a celibate service is any more dedicated or less selfish on that account alone. Indeed, the contrary is equally true. Marriage opens up all sorts of opportunities to provide service that celibacy effectively locks out. Although the authors do not take sides in the debate about mandatory celibacy, at least not in this book, they do demonstrate that the ongoing inability of the Church to enforce the obligation of celibacy, coupled with the elitist lifestyle and secret club mentality that it fosters, can enable child abuse to happen. Later on in this book, we also read the following. What does the Catholic sexual doctrine have to do with clergy sexual abuse and its many variations through the centuries? Firstly, there is an obvious credibility gap of cosmic proportions between the lofty ideals of clerical chastity, the supremacy of virginity, and the tolerance of marital sexuality, and the way church authorities have generally reacted to the sexual activities of the clergy from priests right up to popes. Second, the profound sense of shame that has grown out of this pessimistic and negative dualistic understanding of humanity and sexuality in particular might help explain the obsession with secrecy we will find surrounding clerical sex offences and crimes, and the general reluctance of church authorities to openly admit the existence of this behaviour to the unsuspecting public. Finally, the mystique surrounding celibacy is necessary in order to sustain its rationale and to attract men to initially embrace it in the priesthood and religious life. The exaltation of the celibate ideal has hinged upon selling the idea that celibacy and virginity, even reinvented, are far superior to the lay life or the married state. Celibacy is essential to the continued power and prominence of the clerical subculture, the home of the elite minority who rule the Catholic Church. In spite of the documented history of celibacy violations through the centuries, Catholic leadership has strongly resisted any serious consideration that there might be something wrong with the concept itself. To abandon celibacy would be to risk the demise of the fortified clerical world and the consequent loss of power and influence. Now, I quote from this book not because I think it gives a correct understanding of celibacy, but rather because this is the understanding of celibacy we get when this discipline is uprooted from its true spiritual and theological foundations. In a culture where clerical celibacy has come to be seen as ugly and inhuman, it is not surprising that so many people are calling for it to be abolished. But if clerical celibacy is grounded in a discipline of clerical continence that has apostolic foundations, then abolishing clerical celibacy is not an option. Rather, what we need to do is to recover and articulate a true spiritual and theological understanding of clerical celibacy. So what is the right way to understand clerical celibacy? Now, I don't intend to give a comprehensive answer to this question, but rather I just want to share with you a few passages from the Vatican website that capture an essential aspect of clerical celibacy, namely that it is a radical act of self-giving by which a priest is more closely conformed to Jesus Christ, whose bride is the Church. So in the Vatican II document Presbyterorum Ordinis, we're told that through celibacy, priests profess themselves before men as willing to be dedicated to the office committed to them, namely, to commit themselves faithfully to one man, and to show themselves as a chaste virgin for Christ, and thus to evoke the mysterious marriage established by Christ, and fully to be manifested in the future, in which the Church has Christ as her only spouse. A couple of years later, in 1967, Pope St. Paul VI said the following in the encyclical Sacerdotalis Celibatus: "The free choice of sacred celibacy has always been considered by the Church as a symbol of and stimulus to charity. It signifies a love without reservations. It stimulates to a charity which is open to all. In a life so completely dedicated and motivated, who can see the sign of spiritual narrowness or self-seeking and not see rather that celibacy is and ought to be a rare and very meaningful example of a life motivated by love, by which man expresses his own unique greatness? Who can doubt the moral and spiritual richness of such a life, consecrated not to any human ideal, no matter how noble, but to Christ and to his work to bring about a new form of humanity in all places and for all generations? This biblical and theological view associates our ministerial priesthood with the priesthood of Christ. The total and exclusive dedication of Christ to his mission of salvation provides reason and example for our assimilation to the form of charity and sacrifice proper to Christ our Saviour. This vision seems to us so profound and rich in truth, both speculative and practical, that we invite you, venerable brothers, and you, eager students of Christian doctrine and masters of the spiritual life, and all you priests who have gained a supernatural insight into your vocation, to persevere in the study of this vision, and to go deeply into the inner recesses and wealth of its reality. In this way, the bond between the priesthood and celibacy will more and more be seen as closely knit as the mark of a heroic soul and the imperative call to unique and total love for Christ and his Church. Laid hold of by Christ unto the complete abandonment of one's entire self to him, the priest takes on a closer likeness to Christ, even in the love with which the eternal priest has loved the church, his body, and offered himself entirely for her sake, in order to make her a glorious, holy, and immaculate spouse. The consecrated celibacy of the sacred ministers actually manifests the virginal love of Christ for the church and the virginal and supernatural fecundity of this marriage, by which the children of God are born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh. The final quote I'd like to share is a passage from Pope St. John Paul II's Apostolic exhortation, Pastoris Dabo Vobis. It is especially important that the priest understand the theological motivation of the Church's law on celibacy. Inasmuch as it is a law, it expresses the Church's will even before the will of the subject expressed by his readiness. But the will of the Church finds its ultimate motivation in the link between celibacy and sacred ordination, which configures the priest to Jesus Christ, the head and spouse of the Church. The Church, as the spouse of Jesus Christ, wishes to be loved by the priest in the total and exclusive manner in which Jesus Christ, her head and spouse, loved her. Priestly celibacy, then, is the gift of self in and with Christ to his Church, and expresses the priest's service to the Church in and with the Lord. Now, I think people will find it very hard to take seriously this spousal understanding of clerical celibacy if they think that clerical celibacy was only introduced into the Catholic Church in the 12th century. But what I've been arguing is that clerical celibacy was not an innovation of the 12th century. Rather, clerical celibacy evolved from a discipline of clerical continence in the very early Church, whereby married clerics ceased to have conjugal relations with their wives once they were ordained. When properly understood, clerical celibacy in no way denigrates marriage, but rather clerical celibacy helps us to understand more clearly the sacramental nature of marriage as symbolizing the relationship Christ, our high priest, has with his bride, the Church. This is what we read in St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. No one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body just as Christ does the Church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I am talking about Christ and the Church. Members of the clergy are thus called to see the Church as their bride, insofar as they act in the person of Christ. A priest's love for his bride, the Church, is not a sexual love, but a spiritual love, and if a priest is faithful to his bride, then together they will be very fruitful, bearing the fruit of Jesus Christ that endures for all eternity.